Well, we imagine Woodrow Wilson, our liberal president, our progressive president from 1912 to 1920, and he's sitting out there with his boater hat in 1914, and he is excited. He has overturned the way the government had operated during the time of the forgettable presidents. He had helped create the Federal Trade Commission, which regulated all of business, the Federal Reserve System, which made credit available to Americans, to the democracy. He had started the income tax. Praise be to God for the income tax, because now liberals can pay for a government that's going to transform society and bring us to a better future. Besides, Woodrow Wilson had been the proponent of lighthouse democracy, that somehow the world was going to become more democratic, and he was going to see to it. Of course, he lost his temper a few times, because last time kind of belting Mexico in the nose and belting Haiti in the nose. But by and large, the world was becoming more democratic in 1914 in the summer. So as he looked at his newspaper, there was a chance for elation. He could become the greatest president of all time. And then the Lord Jesus Christ will come, because he's a post-millennialist, and the world will enjoy even more peace and heavenly wonder. And yet at the same time, he experiences this tremendous elation. He knows, in the summer of 1914, that his wife, Ellen, who has slipped on the overly polished floor of the White House, is in deep trouble. She has a lot of internal bleeding. She can't see very well. We now know that she had Bright's disease. And Wilson says at the time that she is struggling in very deep waters, and that there's certain words which if I hear that we share together, it's like I got to stop myself from the floodgates bursting out of me, just crying and losing everything. So he's a man stirred up by that. He also is a man who is worried about the situation in Europe. Now, Europe is, of course, pretty much running the world at this time because of colonization, imperialism everywhere, including China. And yet, the Europeans are at each other's throats. Wilson, a keen student of history, knew that great ancient Greece had been a center of civilization, the 5th century BC. And suddenly, the Greeks started scratching at each other in the Peloponnesian War. And Greece, ever after that, has never been a dominant power. I mean, even today, it's an indebted hobo nation, basically, broke. You know, they had their glory days, and they fell upon each other. Will this same thing happen to Europe? And why, indeed, is Europe scratching at each other and ready to go to war with one another during this time when, since 1900, even the working class has done a little better than it did like in the late 19th century in terms of securing better wages and rights and privileges? And, what's going on here in Europe that we have this kind of dark cloud of hatred? How many families have this happen to them? Kind of big. But anyway, this is Europe. You know, they were all descendants of Victoria, basically, Queen Victoria. So they were like cousins going at it. But what is wrong here with Europe in this situation? Well, there's some sort of really, inbuilt hostility between these two countries, Germany and France. In order to get united in 1871, Germany had stolen Alsace-Lorraine from France. This had brought all the various provinces of Germany together. In the book of Proverbs in the Bible, it says, "Beer is a brawler, but wine a mocker." And the Germans were talking about re-brawling the French, and the French were mocking the Germans with what Victor Hugo, one of their poets, called sacred anger. So there's a lot of hatred there. There is a problem of southeastern Europe, where in the 13th century a Mongol invasion, that Central Asian steppe country, had an incredible invasive hold on the world in the 13th century. They came into southeastern Europe and they knocked all these nationalities around. And so it's very difficult for southeastern Europe to really come into the modern period and have a nation. What do you do if like 10% of your people are Cyrillic? That is, they use the Cyrillic alphabet in the Russian language, which isn't like the Latin alphabet, which means they're also Greek Orthodox rather than Catholic. And then you got another 10% that's Jewish, another 10% that's Muslim, because there are some Muslims like Albania and through here. And then you have another group that declares they're Macedonians, and no one is quite sure what Macedonian means, or another group that claims they're Romanians and Germans. I mean, they're just kind of all thrown together. So it's very hard if you've got all these little separate groups to try to declare yourself a nation, which is why we also have ethnic cleansing in their area and a very difficult situation there yet today. But this was basically where the hotbed of war was getting hotter and hotter, and that was a problem because Germany had an ally. It was called the Axis, the center, Germany and Austria-Hungary, against the so-called allies, France, Russia, Great Britain, and the periphery against this kind of pink core. And basically, just as Wilson feared, something does set it off. And does anyone know what does set it off? Now, this is not World War II. This is not World War II with Adolf Hitler. It's not World War II with the rising sun of Japan and the gas ovens dealing with the Jews. This is World War I, the big war before the big war. Can anyone think of anything in regard to World War I? So it's the war that has like trench warfare, machine guns, howitzers. The landscape looks like some sort of lunar landscape because it's been shot up so much. It's the one with poison gas. It's a very disgusting cannibalistic barbecue that takes some 17 million people. One of the battles, the Battle of Verdun, takes 680,000 troops, more than the whole Civil War combined, just one battle. And we'll maybe show why in a little bit, but I guess I'm a little ahead of the story because how does this war start? It starts because a Bosnian nationalist shoots the Austro-Hungarian emperor, appearing, Franz Ferdinand, with his poor wife, Sophie, who's a Czech and can never be empress because she's using the Cyrillic alphabet when she's never rather than the Latin one. But in any case, the Austrian-Hungarians then say, well, this guy's messing around with the Serbian Slavs, so we're going to invade Serbia. And when that happened, Big Daddy Russia says, well, we're going to defend the Cyrillic Orthodox friends we have against the Germans, and then Austria-Hungary knows that they've got Germany on their side. So Germany comes in, and then France activates its treaty with Russia, goes against Germany. Germany gets at Great Britain by going through the lowlands, and then Great Britain gets on the side of the Allies for that. So you have this Peloponnesian War, you have this conflagration in Europe between all these Christian nations that were controlling the world, all going after one another's throats. Yes, Richard?
The blue is a neutral, right?
Right. The Netherlands and Switzerland, very good. That was a good observation. Yeah, they tried their best to stay out of it.
Spain was neutral?
Yes. Not World War II. They're very much a part of it, as they Francisco Franco and were pro-fascist for a while. And there was kind of a revolution, but this one, sidestep it more. Any other questions? So, as we know, this is like a cannibalistic barbecue, basically, in terms of we can see here an excerpt of a World War I classic, All Quiets in the Western Front. And we see how a war is being industrialized. It's being perfected with the use of machine guns, and people are becoming pawns being shot down. This is why some French army during this time would go, bah, bah, like sheep, just to try to get out of fighting. So these are the Germans, because they have those spiked helmets. It's another trademark of World War I. They did not have spiked helmets in World War II. So the French and English are charging across the lunar landscape, and you have a stationary machine gun there that is waiting for them to get close enough. But imagine you're charging across this, and you have to get over all that barbed wire. And then how do you dodge bullets like this?
That guy named Shimon killed him. That did he kill him?
How many people did he kill? Yeah.
It's impossible to get over there.
Yeah. Yeah, and so thus you have the battle like Verdun or the Battle of Somme, where these people are just cannon fodder. They're just being shot down, and they fight a whole month, lose hundreds of thousands of people for 7 miles. They adjust the salient in 7 miles because they had trenches behind that trench. And so you take that trench, there's still other ones. You gotta answer. So it is a pretty atrocious war. There's a story about a woman in Germany who stands up in the middle of a train in 1916 outside Berlin, and she just stands up in the middle of the train. She goes, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And the people are kind of, getting upset and saying, get that crazy woman out of here, And suddenly a man stands up next to her and says, ladies and gentlemen, please do not be angry or make sport of her. She is my wife, and she has lost all 5 of her sons since the war, and I am taking her now to an asylum. There was the case of the Canary Girls in England that packed explosives into shells during this war, and none of them could ever bear children because of all the toxic materials that they got. This was the war, of course, that had phosgene gas and diphenchlorodizine gas, which induced a tremendous amount of fluid into the lungs, or phosgene gas. Mustard gas was the kind that would cause these lesions on the skin. And one American doughboy, as they called our soldiers at the time, saw one of the soldiers kind of scratched to death in a foxhole because of the use of this poison gas. So certainly something that you would think we'd want to stay out of. And this indeed was, Woodrow Wilson's point. Woodrow Wilson said initially that there's such a thing as a nation being too proud to fight, and that this reminds me of some kind of drunken brawl in a public house. The United States is going to stay out of it. In fact, Wilson wins the election, the presidential election, the second one in 1916, with the slogan, "He kept us out of war." Many Americans indeed want to stay out of the bloodbath. And yet, like previous international conflicts, and as a kind of warning net for today, it's hard for America, with all its trade and its foreign people in here, to just stay neutral. And one of the things that tends to militarize America is the sinking of a British luxury liner, the Lusitania, in May of 1915. So 1,198 civilians go down to the foggy depths because of what? Because the German submarines are playing pretty loose and fast in the high seas. Of course, at this time, the submarines were an important innovation for the Germans in fighting against the superior British Navy. However, the ordinary rules of warfare held that you could stop, say, a neutral vessel, like a trading vessel, or a ship from a neutral nation like the United States. But there were cases where a British trading vessel would stop for a German submarine, and when the German submarine people tried to go on board, they'd blow them out of the water. So the German submarines stopped asking questions, and I guess we can kind of understand that. Now this Lusitania luxury liner was, it could go 25 knots. It could go faster than any submarine. But the Germans were really waiting for it, and they were not asking questions. They got in a periscope, they shot, they sunk the whole thing. There were 128 Americans on board. One Presbyterian journal said in the aftermath that this is the greatest crime against humanity since the crucifixion of Christ. And of course, Woodrow Wilson was a Presbyterian, so many Americans were very upset. William Jennings Bryan, known as the Cowardly Lion, the Wizard of Oz film. Well, William Jennings Bryan says, well, I bet you know that the English were hiding contraband, that is war material aboard, and actually they were. There were some 4 million Remington rifle cartridges on board the Lusitania. There was 1,200 shell casings and boxes of shrapnel, which the English were hiding on board. They were using like their passengers as a kind of cover. So both sides were kind of mixed up in it. But with the sinking of the Lusitania in May of 1915, it becomes very difficult for Americans to stay out of it. Already we've got a group called the Hyphenates, that is like German Americans. Remember, they've got about 500 newspapers still that are pro-German. A lot of Scandinavians, the Irish don't like the English, so they tend to be pro-Axis. Whereas we have then a lot of other Americans known as super patriots, who are like, want one nation, one language, one flag, and see this as maybe an excuse to unite the country. We also even have figureheads emerging for both groups. The German-American Alliance at this time has a petition so long it would add up to 15 miles that they send to Woodrow Wilson to keep us out of war. There's also a Harvard professor by the name of Hugo Münsterberg. The super patriots call him Münsterberg. And he tends to speak up for the German-American cause. And ex-President Theodore Roosevelt, who we saw was so militaristic that he sent his son Quentin in ahead of the war declaration, only to see Quentin die. Theodore Roosevelt is, of course, the preeminent super patriot. And Münsterberg and other Germans, saying that we Americans manufacture picric acid and dum-dum bullets. These were things used in poison gas and really terrible kind of bullets. We Americans prattle about humanity. At the same time, we manufacture these things. 1 million widows, 1 million orphans, 1 million graves in Deutschland, I mean Germany. Bears the legend, made in America. And Roosevelt says, well, I think we've got enough disloyal Americans here. We need to be one nation, one language, one flag. I think that disloyal hyphenates ought to be shot. President Roosevelt calls all hyphenated Americans traitors simply because they do not plow on the same British horn on which he toots continually. 100 years ago, the British bombed Washington. Now they rule Washington. I will set my face like flint against hyphenated Americans, while there are so many disloyal people in Cincinnati that there are not enough telephone poles to hang them all. President Roosevelt wants us to go to war. But why should we allow our boys to become the cannon fodder of the European slaughter barons? Whoa, this is all within America. It's getting upsetting. It even goes into the sacred precincts of religion. One Billy Sunday, whose ancestor's name was Billy Sonntag, he was actually German, but he was a Chicago White Sox ball player, one of the great evangelists of all time. Got involved in a fight when he said, what happens when you take hell and put it upside down and look at it? Made in Germany is stamped on the bottom. These Germans are nothing but a sauerkraut spawn of pretzel chewing Huns. And some guy came right down to the rostrum in Atlanta where this American evangelist was holding forth, trying to kind of be popular and trendy. And there was like a fight that was going on during the revival because this German guy thought that was just kind of unjust. Well, Woodrow Wilson at this time is trying to stay out of war, although maybe I should add he's a little devious because sometimes what he writes and what he does are two different things. And no one will suppress American liberties more than the guy who always says he's concerned about American liberties, Woodrow Wilson, just like his anti-imperialist foreign policy had a little fun little jab to it. But anyway, Wilson desperately is officially trying to keep us out of war at this time. He's also kind of desperate too because Ellen now is dead. And he's always had, as a guy, even though he had big ears and he had pince-nez and he was sort of an academic, he always had this very strong need for female companionship. He one time candidly admitted to a friend, oh, girls and women of all graces and of all beauties, they have such a strong spell over me, it's kind of like I'm bewitched. And around 1915, he's writing in his journal, I feel like I have a volcano in me. Certainly it isn't convenient or easy to always need a strong love. Certainly my salvation consists in me being loved. And yet I am too intense. Whenever I'm with someone with whom I am sincerely and especially interested in, the hardest thing for me to broach is that which is nearest my heart. So he's, feeling very alone. Ellen's dead, and some of his guilt for her was intensified by the fact that he had had this little fling, and probably never consummated, with a Mrs. Peck while he was vacationing in Bermuda earlier in his life to kind of calm his nerves. But in any case, he's driving around with his doctor one day, Dr. Grayson, in 1915. Wilson seems to have had a series of minor strokes through his life, so he was constantly unwell. And suddenly Grayson sees this kind of buxom woman, and he honks the horn, and they stop the car, and he talks to her, and then they talk off again. And Wilson asks Dr. Grayson, "Who is that beautiful woman that you were just talking to?" And Grayson says, "Well, that's Edith Bowling Galt. She's a widow of a guy that was like the wealthiest jeweler in all Washington." Well, Wilson wants to know her name and where he can find her, and so he sends her this letter, which please come to the White House. And well, she knew that Wilson was in the car, but I guess it's sort of an opportunity. So she comes in, and Ellen, his previous wife, had been looking kind of dowdy, kind of big by the time that she had gotten Bright's disease. But Edith really retained her. She had a kind of native beauty anyway. She was a very buxom woman, very attractive figure. And she walks in the White House, and one of the doormen kind of winks to the other doorman in the White House and says, "She's a looker." And the other doorman says, pointing to Wilson, "And he's a goner." Well, Wilson has her come out to the back veranda, and he just begins chatting up a storm. And suddenly, he basically says, "Edith, I just know that I love you and I want to marry you right now. You're the woman I wanted now." And she says, "Well, you don't even know me." But in any case, she finally disentangles herself from him when she gets home. And the next day there's a letter waiting for her, flowers waiting for her. The next day, more letters, flowers. He does this every day. Finally gets her to come to the White House again. Finally, she writes him, and she says, "You have been very honest with me, but I must be very frank with you. I am not just going to be your friend, and I will not be courted by you." ... But then she goes on and says some other things, and then finally she ends a note. "But it is very sweet to know that the President of the United States needs me." Well, he just kind of, just focuses on that last part. He keeps up this tirade, One day, new letter, new flowers. And finally, after a month of this treatment, she finally says, "Well, I guess I'll go out with him." And she goes to the Washington Senators baseball game, and the couple become photographed quite repeatedly, although not with very good cameras, as you can kind of see, as people were anticipating this historic event with Edith and Woodrow together. Well, it is Woodrow, indeed, when you get this charming woman, give him some solace by his side. Oops, didn't let me tell the story. But in any case, we find that Wilson is even more and more torn apart now as the country is torn apart over the war. There is a kind of economic tilt that we are making toward the Axis powers, toward the Allied powers, that is the English and the French and the Russians, at this time. Because the British have a very good blockade of the Germans, we really couldn't help the Germans anyway, although the House of Morgan and the pro-English slant of the American government probably would have made it a point anyway that Americans would have aided the Allies. So from 1914 to 1916, our trade goes up from about $1 billion to the Allies to $3 billion. We loan the Allies $3 billion, particularly the House of Morgan, which is pro-English, we might remember. But then again, there's some German-American banks in our country, but they can only get out a few $100 million worth of loans to Germany. So the equation is that if England fails, all these people who have savings accounts in American banks may find them losing this money because it would be a bad investment, in the Allies. So America has a sort of private kind of economic thing going on, hoping that the Allies will win. So Germany realizes this. For a while, it calls in its submarine wolf pack and refuses to take down neutral vessels. But in the final analysis, it decides that it can knock out Britain and France when it gets rid of Russia. And they get them to sign the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in 1918. And so they have 1 million more troops to go in on the west. They think they can knock out Britain and France, and then they can, if they can just get Mexico Mexico to hold down the United States in its hemisphere. They could then reward Mexico. And so what ensues then is, of course, the Zimmermann telegram sent by Arthur Zimmermann to Mexico. Does anyone know anything about this telegram? Well, the Mexican government, looked it over. Venustiano Carranza was the president of Mexico at this time. When he considered it, the Germans were offering Mexico back Texas, Arizona, and New Mexico. So you can imagine a lot of Texans were upset about it when the British decrypted the telegram. But the Mexicans decided that Germany was behind in a lot of their financial payments. They were kind of doubting that Germany was as powerful as they said they were, that they could really reward Mexico after the war. And so Mexico said basically no, but it of course inflamed the Americans. And whereas it was the voice of the super patriots to gun for war in 1915, suddenly it was the voice of American nationalism and U.S. Steel gunning for war. Wilson has a fateful meeting with his cabinet, and every single person in his cabinet is for war at the end. It was said that Wilson, in the last pre-war cabinet meeting, just broke down and cried like a baby when he realized he was going to send the country to war. Once again, though, Wilson is a funny kind of guy who says he hates war, but yet we know that he did get involved in it a number of times. So as he gets enough steam now to get with the War Declaration in April of 1917, he now knows, though, that he is also a little stronger inside because Edith has said yes. And the two, in fact, will go on to have a very close relationship. And at first, maybe Woodrow Wilson wasn't Edith's ultimate romantic fantasy. But by marrying the President of the United States, she did have some advantages. Because Wilson, of course, changed his stance on women's suffrage, and will, of course, get the 19th Amendment, which in 1920 will allow women to vote for the presidential election for the first time. So the Democratic Party, led by Wilson, becomes open to women voting at this time, even as he's marrying this more sophisticated Edith Poland. Well, that's nice. He's got his domestic front covered again, but now he's going against the big shadows of the Great War. Now, you can lose a war like this. America is not prepared. We only got like about 50,000 troops that are ready to fight. We only got about 55 out-of-date airplanes, even though we were the ones that first developed the airplane, and Kitty Hawk with the Wright brothers. The Europeans have become far better at it. Think of the Russians. They were knocked out by the Germans. And Brest-Litovsk, they lost a fourth of their territory. That would be like losing the whole American South. They lost a fourth of their industry. So there's big winners and big losers in this war, and we're not really ready for it. So it's a really reluctant heart. There are three really looming problems that kind of are intersecting. One is the idea of dissent. There's so many hyphenated Americans, that is German American, Irish American, that are opposed to the war. In New Ulm, Minnesota, which is like all German, there's like this referendum, anti-war referendum. 100% of the city votes, against going to war. Then there's a problem of disarray. We're going to have to spend $33 billion, which is more than the American government has spent since the time of George Bush in 1789 in this war. How are we going to get the money for that? And then there's the problem of, possible military defeat. Since we're so unready, and since the Germans are unleashing 1 million now on the Western Front, maybe they'll just break through and then stage a quick invasion of the United States. And who knows, have another Treaty of Brest-Litovsk will do to us what they did to Russia. Well, the first problem then with dissent. How does Wilson deal with the problem that there's so many millions of German Americans and there are so many hundreds of thousands of socialists and anarchists that are opposed to the war, and Scandinavian Americans, and Hungarian Americans, and Irish Americans that don't really care. People that live generally in Minnesota, North Dakota, just not too excited about it, as well as Central Texas for that matter. Well, Wilson does sign some pretty severe anti-First Amendment rights type laws in World War I. It's a big clampdown on American civil liberties, done by the liberal president. So we have the Alien and Sedition Acts in 1918 and 1919, which make it illegal to defame the government. Aliens means that the government can round up people who aren't nationalized. Alien and sedition. Sedition means you can't talk against the government. Like one German American who in Utica, New York said, "I think the president's an ape," and he was arrested for that. There was a German American newspaper, the Cleveland Anzeiger, that had 5 German editors arrested in succession because they were anti-patriotic in the sense of this war and going along with Wilson. So this is why some writers like Jonah Goldberg has written about liberal fascism, that never was fascism stronger in America than when a liberal president, baby liberal progressive Woodrow Wilson, cut down on American rights during World War I. Kind of an interesting case is the situation with German music, classical music. The Germans monopolized American music at this time, classical music. And it was said, that being German was really fun because the Germans were always right. They had Beethoven, dun 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 dun, symphonic music. And there was a German alien, not naturalized, who conducted the Boston Symphony Orchestra, Karl Muck. And this Muck had said some very diminutive things about American orchestral players. Like one time he said about this guy that was playing a timpani, "That sounds like the thumping of a toilet seat." Or people were playing the stringed instruments, he says, "That sounds like cats and chickens screeching in the basement." Well, one of the kind of devious things that Wilson does in this war is he goes along with the formation of the American Protective League, which was a kind of like a primitive FBI. Someone like Carey, for instance, could join up with the police in his town and spy on other people. Someone's got a good record, as I assume Carey does. Or have you been pulled over a few times like me for speeding? Actually, more than
Since
4
my
times.
life was about a month ago, I
Oh,
haven't had.
okay. Oh, that's good. I've been pulled over way too many times with Mount Pleasant cops. When I lived in San Marcos and I taught Texas State, they would say, "Oh, you're a prof at Texas State? Okay, no problem." Around here, who cares? Yeah.